Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to Water Tanks, and finally we have some statistics of the upcoming new Tier 10 Chinese heavy tank, the BZ-75. Wargaming have given us an idea of what the top of the tree crown of the new Chinese branch is going to look like, and it's going to have a choice of two guns, a 180mm gun and a 152mm caliber gun, and also the vehicle is going to have access to the new boost mode, where it gets to use rockets to be able to accelerate itself, albeit limited amounts of time in the battle. So unfortunately this time Wargaming haven't actually given us screenshots of the tank to get a visual idea of what it's going to look like. So all I can really go off is the picture that we have at the top of this infographic. And we clearly see that there's going to be a bit of a weak point on top by the looks of it. Also, I'm wondering how this very flat surface on the turret is going to hold up against high penetration rounds. And the only model we have so far is of the BZ-176. This is a Tier 8 premium vehicle, and as we can see from this, this thing had, I'd say, better turret armor, it looks like, than what the Tier 10 is going to have with that weak point on top. Although whether that weak point is even a weak point remains to be seen. One of the interesting mechanics about these Chinese heavy tanks is when you lower the gun to be able to use the gun depression, the top of the vehicle actually raises up. And this is actually only 29mm of armor on the Tier 8 Premium. Whether this is going to happen with the Tier 10, again, remains to be seen. But this will actually be overmatchable by all 90mm caliber guns. So it looks like Wargaming are giving these vehicles weak points in a roundabout way. Again, I'd like to clarify all of this is currently on the super test, and so it is subject for change. And all of the statistics you see that I'm theory crafting in the video here are just so that we can get an overall idea of how these Chinese derpy heavy tanks are going to end up. So, as I've shown in a previous video, the boost mechanic looks a lot like this. You're able to activate the jet boosters out the back of the vehicle, but we actually now have statistics about how it's going to affect the top speed and also the engine power of the Tier 10. Wargaming have clearly given us these. Now, to make it all simpler, I've put this on an Excel spreadsheet, but just quickly, for the people out there who are thinking already, when you see the statistics of this tank, I want to get my hands on it as quickly as I can, what tips can I give you? Well, firstly, prepare a crew. It looks like it's going to have a commander, a gunner, a driver, and a radio operator, not a loader. So start preparing those 4 crew members on this tank. I do expect that the radio operator will also be a loader, but they are going to have to be a radio operator type crew member, and then eventually you can get some extra loader skills on them. I think the radio operator is probably going to end up with the most high pressure on this tank, so I would thoroughly recommend a premium crew member with 0 skill brothers in arms on the radio operator slot, especially as now 6 Sense is for free on the commander, and that's not going to be such a high pressure role. Also, a tip that I have for all of you is to make sure you repurchase the Type 58, the Tier 6 Chinese medium tank, and uncheck accelerated crew training to be fully prepared for the new Tier 7 heavy tank that will be coming on the Chinese branch. Okay, so I've got 2 BZ-75s up here for you, one with the 152mm and one with the 180mm, and it's quite hard to find tanks to really compare this vehicle to, so I'm going to be comparing it to a Type 5 Heavy if you're using the derpy gun on that tank. So immediately we notice that the BZ-75 with the 152mm has 650 alpha damage. Not great amounts of damage for such a large caliber gun, kind of the same as an Object 705A, for example. The HE round's a little bit better at 840. It has a standard amount of penetration at 258. It has a standard amount of heat pen of 319 and pretty good HE pen at 90mm, but nothing exceptional. The rate of fire of this vehicle is going to be 3.5 rounds a minute with the lower caliber gun, and that gives this thing an okay damage per minute of 2,300, so pretty much the same as a 60 TP within that regard. Just it's going to suffer because while you do have access to that 152mm, which is great for overmatching 50mm plates, you're just going to be out-traded by E100s and 60 TPs when it comes to being that big alpha damage super heavy. However, this is where the 180mm gun comes in on the BZ-75, and this is going to be like an old school HE derp. It has 1050 damage on its armor piercing round. That is the same as, hold on, this is actually interesting. Is it actually an HE shell with that much penetration on its standard round? And that is because I'm even confusing myself. The derp gun, the 180, actually comes with standard HE and a special HE round, which is kind of like Hesh, as in it's got more penetration, but it's actually got less alpha damage. So the special round on this vehicle is going to have 1050 alpha damage and 225 millimeters of pen, and you should expect that you'll have to pay lots of credits to be able to achieve that. So when you take a look at my comparison here, I've actually put the 1050 in the wrong spot. That is going to be for the gold rounds. They're going to be expensive, and I'll have to put the pen of the premium round here. Accordingly, that means that the 180mm on this vehicle, it looks like it's not going to have a standard round, so to say, i.e. an armor-piercing round that you would be used to on the Type 5 Heavy. Nevertheless, having 1050 alpha damage on its special round with 225mm of penetration will be absolutely wonderful. However, that is the maximum penetration on this tank because of the lack of a stereotypical gold round on this vehicle, which means that how are you going to deal with penetrating tier 9 heavy tanks, let alone the tier 10 ones? You're either going to have to try and flank, you're either going to have to try and just hope that you can hit a weak point, or just be happy splashing damage on your opponent, as you're not going to be able to overmatch with the 180. That would have been so special on this tank because you could have overmatched all 59mm plates and larger. And I would question Wargaming, why are you kind of going backwards in game design with regards to these derpy guns? Think about the Type 5 Heavy, for example. The Type 5 Heavy did not have an armor-piercing round for the longest of time on its 152mm caliber gun. And Wargaming had to add it in when they nerfed the high explosive rounds in the game. Now the Type 5 Heavy can do 680 damage with 252mm of pen, and its premium HE has 192mm of pen with 900. Now, if anyone's played the derpy gun on the Type 5 Heavy and you've spammed gold at your opponents, you'll know it is absolutely horrendous. And without firing armor piercing on that tank, it's awful. And I can tell you, trying to make the derp gun work on the Type 5 Heavy, even with the recently buffed intuition allowing me to switch out shells and use the correct one for the job, has made that tank feel like pulling teeth with the larger caliber gun. And so I've actually gone back to using the 140mm on the Type 5 Heavy, and since I have, it has absolutely massively increased my average damage that I deal per battle, and it also has significantly increased my impact in them with it, and my win ratio will start to go up again in the Type 5 Heavy. I can tell you the derp gun on the Type 5 Heavy just isn't worth it, and that is a derp gun with access to also an armor piercing round, which the Chinese heavy tank, at least when you use the 180, is not going to have. Nevertheless, 1050 damage, if you can manage to penetrate that with 225, is going to make you giggle. But we already have a 225mm penetration round inside the game. Effectively, it's on the FV215B183 or the FV4005. And you know how much this round trolls people. But this round has 230mm of pen and deals 1750 damage. That will make the derpy gun on the BZ-75 look really awful. One thing that is nice, however, is the fact that this thing gets a tremendous high explosive round for 1,600 alpha damage, but it only has 75mm of penetration. Again, I'm thinking kind of Jagdpanzer E100. A Jagdpanzer E100 has 1,400 alpha damage on its high explosive round and 85mm of penetration. However, you don't really see people using that, right? And I think that with the derpy gun, the 180mm, it looks like Wargaming are kind of making a Jagdpanzer E100. It's just got less pen on its HE, it's got massively less pen on its high explosive round compared to the AP, and it just doesn't have access to heat. Now, I'm not suggesting that we want to have a heavy tank go into the game that has a gun like the Jagdpanzer E100, but it's quite interesting that lack of armor-piercing round on this tank. I think it's going to massively affect the vehicle. And I think if Wargaming wanted to make it just a little bit more flexible, they could easily give it an 850 alpha damage armor-piercing round that still had about 250 or 260 millimeters of penetration. Otherwise, I truly think this thing is going to struggle because it only fires 2 rounds a minute with this 180mm derp. That gives the vehicle 2,100 damage per minute if you can manage to penetrate to 225mm of penetration. Of course, if you can penetrate the high explosive rounds, again only 75, that's 3,200. But quite often the vehicles that you penetrate with those high explosive rounds aren't going to have 1,600 hit points to give you. Maybe they'll be like a tier 8 light tank or something, and sure, it'll be fun one-shotting them if you can manage to get them to sit still, I guess. But it just feels like this gun is going to be so cumbersome. And so I'm not really so excited for the BZ-75 when it comes to firepower so far. The 152mm gun looks fairly disappointing. The 180mm caliber gun doesn't look super competitive. Not good news so far, in my opinion at least, with the firepower of the BZ-75, although it will be capable of some funny things still. The gun handling, however, is quite nice. It's got 0.4 accuracy on both of its guns, which definitely one-ups the derp gun on the Type 5 Heavy. 2.7 seconds aim time to 3 seconds. That's actually very nice for large caliber guns. 8 degrees of gun depression, which will allow you to be fairly flexible on a ridgeline, unlike most other hard-hitting vehicles, apart from the 60 TP, which also has 8 degrees of gun depression. 20 degrees of gun elevation, which again could be quite interesting when we factor in whether the gun is going to come up through the turret or not. Such a bizarre mechanic. 24 degrees a second turret reverse, which one-ups the Type 5 Heavy. The gun handling is not so great, at 0.2 when moving, 0.2 when turning the hull, and the lower caliber gun has 0.15 when turning the turret, with the larger caliber gun 0.2 when turning the turret. So this is definitely going to be a tank that it looks like you want to have vertical stabilizers on, but it's also a tank that it looks like you want to use an aiming device on, but it also looks like a tank that you probably want to try and be able to pump up every single aspect of the vehicle. I think this is going to be one of those kind of tanks that it looks like you want to have 4 equipment slots on. So let's talk about the mobility of the BZ-75, and this is where it gets a little interesting. The base engine power of the vehicle is 800. However, this substantially increases when you use the jet booster, which comes with 6 charges that you can use immediately 5 seconds after the battle begins. The boost duration will be 10 seconds, and then you will have a 5-second cooldown before you can boost once again. Now, when you boost, the engine power of this vehicle is going to increase from 13, or 12.9 if we're being specific, up to 32.26. That gives this thing like light tank level power to weight ratio when it's using the boost, which will help propel the vehicle up to its new top speed limit of 53 kilometers an hour. And that's going to get up there pretty quickly. If you're going along the flat, it might even help you get up to 53 when you're going up slope. So lots of opportunities. But remember, they are limited and you're only going to have 6 of them during the battle. However, still 60 seconds of boosting during the battle, that's quite healthy. I can imagine the moments where you get to use a boost to ram something as well in this vehicle, and considering it weighs 60 tons, yeah, I think this thing is gonna hurt a lot of vehicles. That's kind of like E50M level ramming technique there. Now, when you aren't boosting, however, this vehicle is going to be limited to 35 forwards and 15 backwards. I quite like that reverse speed, kind of feels a bit like a mouse within that regard, but 35 forwards makes this thing look really sluggish compared to a lot of the tanks that have been going into the game recently. This may or may not be improvable with field mods. Again, that's definitely a region where I'd want to get a turbo on this thing, as it is the same as a Super Conqueror, and I feel sluggish in that tank. However, unlike the Super Conqueror, which has really good gun handling, this tank doesn't, so you're probably going to want to use vertical stabilizers. Again, I think this is going to be a high pressure tank with the kinds of equipment. One thing that's interesting as well is that when you use the jet booster, you can't go backwards anymore. You can go backwards at 1 kilometer an hour when you're boosting. Okay. Well, I guess you are committing to going forwards when you use that. Should be hilarious seeing people trying to use the boosters to ram you if you can evade them, and then just seeing them just continuing to try and ram the rock that hopefully is behind you, and then you get to flank them and be able to get them in the sides. And I really wonder what will happen to the traverse speed of this vehicle when you use the boost. Will it actually lower the traverse speed, or will the traverse speed actually kind of increase? Surely if both of the jet boosters are going off behind you, you're not going to be able to just activate one. What also will happen if you track a tank that is being boosted? I expect that it's just going to stop the tank. But can you imagine how hilarious would it be if the jet booster made it so that the tank just started spinning in circles? Wargaming, please, 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 please put in some kind of new physics so that when you track somebody who is using the jet boost, that it makes them overturn. I guess tanks already do that. If you track a light tank, it already kind of does a bit of a semicircle, but I just think it'd be just so much more hilarious with this Chinese heavy tank line when they use the boosters if something really funky happened when you tracked them. Or maybe if you could shoot the booster on the back and then it just made them do circles. Oh, I'd love it so much. Anyway, that's probably not how physics works, actually. If you were to just knock off one of the engines, it's not like suddenly it just does circles. It just has less engine power, I guess. Really? Obviously, it's going to be slightly off-center, but not. Anyway, all of you engineers out there, now I can already hear you frantically typing in the comments down below. I digress. Focus on what you need to get done, QuickyBaby, and trying to not make this another 20-minute video, although even by stopping and discussing that, I'm increasing the video length. Oh well. The hull traverse on this vehicle, 30 degrees a second. The ground resistances they're not very good. In fact, the Type 5 Heavy has massively better ground resistances on medium and soft than the BZ-75, which means that even though that vehicle has a worse power to weight ratio than the Chinese Heavy, I think those ground resistances are really going to hold the tank back from being able to do some wild things. So now let's talk about the armor of the BZ-75, an important aspect on any heavy tank. And in this case, it's actually really good news. 200 millimeters at the front, 110 at the side, and 60 at the rear. Now that's not nearly as good as a Type 5 Heavy, but remember that Japanese tank is thick, but very flat at the same time. Whereas this one looks like it's got nice, well-angled armor. Kind of looks like the hull on other Chinese heavy tanks like the WZ-111-5A. And if it is thick and also angled, that means that the hull on this thing could be really good indeed. Now, when it comes down to the turret, it's 330 at the front and 165 at the side and 70 at the rear. Now that probably means 165 that the sidearm is going to be quite poor when you over-angle it. I also really worry about this bar along here, whether this is going to be 330 or not. I mean, if it's 330, then that means that nothing's really going to be going through it, apart from very high penetration rounds when it's turning its turret towards the side, or if a Jagdpanzer E100 decides that they want to have their wicked way with you. But to be fair, if a Jagdpanzer E100 with 420mm of heat pen wants you, I don't think there's really too much that you can do about it. All in all, this looks like it's going to be a very well armored turret, and 2,500 hit points is also very substantial as well. And so if you've got 5 or 6 equipment slots, maybe you can fit a durability device on there as well, or just have 2 builds, one for your city maps where you really don't need to improve the speed, or maybe you don't even need better accuracy when you're fighting in close quarters combat, and you will be able to make this a very healthy tank. And so that means that the BZ-75 is kind of this like it's a mix of tanks, really. It's got an opportunity to be a derp tank. It's got an opportunity to be a regular kind of heavy tank with reasonable DPM, but not great DPM. It's got mediocre gun handling. It's kind of fast when it uses its jet boost, but also not fast when it's not outside of that minute, which it'll be able to be boosting. And can you imagine how soul-destroying it will be if you've either saved a boost that you don't get to use, or alternatively, if you don't have a boost to use towards the end of the battle when you could have really used it to get away from that heavy tank that's chasing you down. But the armor on this vehicle and the durability looks impressive. Final mention should be made to the view range 390, which that'll be annoying for all of the free-to-play players out there who don't use a premium consumable, but with the way that Wargaming have increased view range using field mods for all of the heavy tanks, for all of you players out there, with a decent crew with recon, situational awareness, brothers in arms, a premium consumable, and maybe even putting vents on this tank, again, if you've got like 6 different equipment slots, you'll have no trouble going beyond the reaching that 460 meters view range sweet spot. So all in all, the BZ-75, it's looking interesting. It will definitely be a different kind of tank, and I always like it when Wargaming add different flavors of vehicles into the game. Kind of worried that Wargaming are missing out on an armor-piercing round here for the 180mm. I think that even if it had like lesser alpha damage of 850 maybe, but just made the tank a little bit more playable, that would be interesting. It's still going to be an interesting tank with or without. It's just I was hoping that this was going to be like a true derp lord, but it looks like that gun is going to be more of a meme on this vehicle. And then you're going to have like a 650 alpha damage. More generic heavy than I thought the vehicle was going to be. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that was my initial preview of the first statistics that we have for the Tier 10 Chinese heavy tank, the BZ-75. Once again, remember, start your crew if you want to, and remember that characteristics are not final and everything is subject to change. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Maybe you found it useful, maybe you found it fun. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know in the comments what you think about the BZ-75. Do you think it looks absolutely incredible? Do you think it looks absolutely terrible? And does this increase your excitement for the Chinese heavy tanks? Or do you think that this is one that you're probably going to skip out on? And how do you think that they'll be for the game? Do you think jet boosters are something that fits in World of Tanks? What do you think about the derpy gun on this vehicle? Do you think it's going to be competitive or not? And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.